She arrived with nothing but 2 dresses, a faded Bible, and a heart worn thin from too many losses. Hired only to cook and clean for 6 motherless girls. Clara Weaver didn't expect to stay long, and she certainly didn't expect the smallest one to call her mama before the week was through. But in a house built on silence and sorrow, her prayers, her hands, and her stubborn heart began to stitch something back together, piece by piece, day by day, until what started as survival became home. If you believe healing comes in small, steady steps, stay with us. The wind moved across the Nebraska plains like a restless prayer, tugging at fence posts and rattling loose boards on the Langley ranch house. Dust curled in the air, thin and persistent, as though the earth itself hadn't tasted rain in months. Clara Weaver sat stiff-backed on the wagon seat, her gloved hands knotted tightly in her lap. Her carpetbag rested against her boots, worn and scuffed from too many miles and too many years. Inside it lay all she had left: 2 dresses, a Bible with pages thinned from turning, and a photograph so faded the faces on it had become little more than shadows. The ranch appeared on the horizon like something unfinished, half standing, half forgotten. The house leaned to the right, as though bowing under the weight of its own sorrow. Porch steps sagged at the corners. Window frames bore peeling paint like cracked skin. Even the barn stood at a tilt, one door hanging open with stubborn defiance. The driver pulled the reins, bringing the wagon to a halt near the front gate. Clara climbed down without help, her boots sinking into the soft dirt. The air smelled of dry hay, distant cattle, and the faintest trace of wood smoke. She paused, smoothing the front of her skirt with hands that still trembled more than she liked. Her heart beat hard against her ribs, not from the journey, but from the simple, impossible weight of starting over again. A movement caught her eye. A small figure, barefoot, dirt-smudged and wide-eyed, peered at her from behind the porch railing. The child couldn't have been more than 5. A tangle of blonde curls framed her face, and her dress hung loose around thin shoulders. Clara lifted a hand in greeting, her smile soft but unsure. The girl ducked away, disappearing behind the doorframe like a sparrow into tall grass. Before Clara could knock, the front door creaked open. Matthew Langley stood there, filling the space with a presence that felt both solid and tired. He was tall, broad across the shoulders, with dark hair that curled slightly at the edges where his hat had pressed it flat. His shirt sleeves were rolled to his elbows, revealing forearms lean with work and sun. His face was unreadable, lined with something deeper than age, his eyes shadowed with too many sleepless nights. "Mr. Langley," Clara said, clearing her throat, forcing her voice into something steady. "Clara Weaver, widowed. 2 years this past spring. I cook, I clean. I know how to keep a house and how to keep children in line when need be." Matthew gave a slow, almost imperceptible nod. His gaze drifted down to the bag at her feet, then back to her face. "House is out back of the barn," he said, "but you'll eat with us. Girls need someone. Don't expect it to be easy." "I don't expect anything at all," Clara replied, straightening her shoulders. He stepped aside, gesturing for her to enter. Inside, the house smelled of cedar, old ashes, and something else. Loneliness woven thick into the walls. The floor creaked under her boots. The kitchen table sat cluttered with empty cups, a broken wooden toy, and a scattering of sewing pins left abandoned mid-project. From the staircase, soft footsteps scurried, too quick to catch sight of more faces. Clara swallowed hard. "How many children?" she asked. 6, Matthew said simply, like it was both answer and confession. "All girls. Oldest is 12. Youngest just turned 5. The number hung heavy in the air. Clara turned toward the sink, where a stack of dishes sat untouched. Her hands twitched toward them by instinct. "I'll need flour, salt, and lard if you've got it," she said, rolling her sleeves. "And I'll need them soon if you want supper before dark." Matthew didn't reply, but when she turned back, she found him already moving toward the root cellar door, as though some long-stilled wheel had started turning again. That night, after the girls had gone to bed, after bellies were full for the first time in what felt like days, Clara sat alone at the edge of her small cot in the back room. With shaking hands, she opened her Bible. She didn't know what to pray for exactly, not yet, so she simply whispered, "Let me do right by them." and let the words fall into the dark like seeds. Mornings on the Langley Ranch began before the sun touched the horizon. By the time the first pale light cracked open the sky, Clara already stood at the stove, sleeves rolled high, stirring biscuit dough with a practiced hand. The air filled with the smell of flour and salt, and the slow warmth of baking. The girls drifted into the kitchen like cautious deer, one by one, drawn by hunger and curiosity. Addie, the smallest, came first, barefoot and clutching a threadbare blanket. Her hair stuck out in every direction, her cheeks still rosy from sleep. She climbed onto a chair without asking, folding her legs beneath her, watching Clara with round, unblinking eyes. "Good morning," Clara said softly, without turning. The little girl said nothing, but she didn't leave either. By the time the biscuits came out of the oven, 4 more sisters had appeared. They sat at the table, shoulders hunched, glancing between Clara and their father like they weren't sure where to place their trust. Matthew entered last, hair still damp from washing, wearing the same quiet expression he wore like armor. Before anyone touched a plate, Clara paused, wiping her hands on her apron. "If it's all right," she said, glancing toward Matthew, "I'd like to say grace." He looked up from his coffee cup, surprise flickering across his face like the briefest shift in wind. But he nodded once. The girls froze mid-reach, their gazes swinging toward Clara, waiting. She bowed her head. "Lord, we thank you for this food, for these hands that gathered and prepared it. Watch over this house. Grant strength for the day ahead. And," she hesitated, her throat tightening before she forced the words out, "and let love grow here, in whatever way it's meant to." When she lifted her head, no one spoke, but the girls began eating with more appetite than she'd seen the night before. That afternoon, Clara began tackling the laundry. The pile waiting behind the house was near overwhelming. Linen stiff with old dirt, dresses stained at the hem, socks with holes worn through both heels and toes. Clara boiled water over a fire in the yard, hauling bucket after bucket from the pump. Her arms burned, her back ached, but she didn't stop. Halfway through scrubbing the third load, Eliza, the middle child with quick hands and sharper eyes, appeared at the edge of the yard. "Can I help?" she asked, voice hesitant but hopeful. Clara nodded without ceremony, handing the girl a washboard. Side by side, they worked in silence, dipping fabric and wringing it out, the rhythm of their labor falling into something steady and almost companionable. By late afternoon, the clothesline sagged under the weight of drying garments, fluttering in the soft autumn breeze like prayer flags strung across the yard. That night, after the girls had been tucked in and the lamps blown low, Clara sat on the edge of her cot again, Bible open across her lap. This time she prayed longer, for each girl by name: Hannah, Ruth, Eliza, Sarah, Rachel, Addie. For Matthew, who carried more silence than any man should, and for herself, for the strength to stay, and for the grace to know when she was needed, and when she wasn't. In the days that followed, small things began to change. Eliza brought her a handful of late-blooming daisies from the pasture fence. Ruth, after burning her hand on the stove, came running to Clara, not Matthew, for comfort and bandages. Addie, barely awake most mornings, began toddling straight to Clara's skirts, burying her face there before saying a word to anyone else. Matthew noticed. Of course he did. She caught him watching more often now, during meals, during chores, during the rare quiet moments when she sat on the porch mending clothes while the girls played in the yard. One evening, after the girls had gone to bed and Clara stood outside shaking dust from a rug, Matthew stepped onto the porch beside her. "You've done more for this house in 3 weeks than I managed in a year," he said, voice low, gaze fixed on the horizon. Clara didn't answer right away. She shook the rug one last time, then let it fall over the porch rail. "I don't know how long I'll stay," she said finally, not daring to look at him. "But while I'm here, I'll do what's needed." Matthew's breath left him slow, like he wanted to say more but didn't know how. "Fair enough," he said after a long pause. Then he turned and disappeared back into the house, leaving Clara standing there alone with the dust still settling around her feet. The first storm of the season rolled in without warning. By mid-afternoon, the sky had shifted to a dull, aching gray, and the wind began rattling the shutters like impatient hands demanding to be let in. The air turned sharp with the scent of rain and distant lightning. Clara moved through the house quickly, securing windows, pulling the girls indoors from the yard, and lighting lanterns against the gathering dark. When the first crack of thunder split the sky, Addie screamed. Clara dropped the stack of folded linens in her arms and rushed to the child's side, scooping her up before the next burst of lightning flashed across the room. "It's just noise, sweet girl," Clara whispered, holding her tight, rocking her back and forth as the wind howled against the walls. "It can't hurt you." But Addie clung to her neck like she was drowning, her sobs hiccuping against Clara's collarbone. The other girls clustered near the hearth, huddled together, their faces pale and wide-eyed. Clara glanced toward the door, half expecting Matthew to appear and offer reassurance, but he stayed outside, braving the storm, checking the barn, making sure the livestock were safe. The rain came hard, drumming against the roof like fists. When at last the worst of it passed, Matthew entered the house, dripping wet, his shirt plastered to his skin and his hair dark with rain. He paused just inside the doorway, taking in the sight of Clara seated on the floor, Addie curled in her lap, the other girls scattered like fallen leaves around her. For a long, breathless second, neither of them spoke. Then, without a word, Matthew crossed the room, knelt beside them and laid a large, calloused hand on Addie's back. The little girl's sobs slowed, her small body trembling less with each passing breath. "Good job," Matthew murmured to Clara, so soft she almost didn't hear it. Then he rose, disappearing toward the back room to change his clothes. That night, after the girls were asleep, Clara stood alone in the kitchen, drying dishes by lantern light. The storm had passed, but the air still hummed with leftover electricity, like something unfinished still lingered in the walls. She set the last plate aside and pulled her Bible from the shelf where she'd tucked it earlier that week. Turning to the Psalms, she let her finger trace familiar lines, verses she hadn't read aloud in years. Her voice broke the quiet. "God is our refuge and strength, a very present help in trouble." The words filled the kitchen like warm breath on cold glass. From the hallway she heard the creak of floorboards. Matthew stood in the doorway, one shoulder resting against the frame, watching her with that same unreadable expression he always wore when he didn't know how to speak what was on his mind. "I used to hear her say that," he said after a long pause. Clara's hand froze on the page. "Your wife?" Matthew nodded once. "When storms came, or when one of the girls was sick, she'd say it." Clara closed the Bible gently, placing it back on the shelf. "She was right," she said. Matthew didn't reply, but as he turned and walked back down the hallway, Clara felt the air between them shift, just slightly, but enough to notice. Over the next few days, the rhythm of life on the ranch softened. Matthew lingered longer at the table after meals. The girls grew bolder with their questions, asking Clara about her life before Nebraska, about the places she'd seen, about whether she knew any songs their mother used to sing. And on a cool Saturday morning, when Clara stepped onto the porch with a basket of sewing, she found a new chair waiting there. Sturdy, handmade, just the right size for her. A quiet offering, no words attached. But when she sat in it, she smiled into the morning sun, letting its warmth soak into her skin. That night, before blowing out the lamp, Clara knelt beside her bed and whispered a prayer she hadn't dared speak until now. "Lord, if this is where you mean for me to stay, show me how to belong here." The words floated into the dark like a question left hanging, but for the first time she didn't feel quite so alone while waiting for the answer. Illness came in the middle of the night, swift and without mercy. It started with Ruth. One moment she was fine, laughing over a game of marbles with her sisters before bed, and the next, she lay curled beneath her quilt, burning with fever, her breath shallow and quick. By dawn, Eliza and Sarah were coughing too, their small bodies racked with tremors Clara couldn't calm. Clara moved from bed to bed, placing cool cloths on flushed foreheads, coaxing spoonfuls of water past cracked lips, whispering soft words of comfort she barely believed herself. Her hands never stopped, boiling water, brewing bitter teas, stirring thin broth in the kitchen and praying each child would swallow at least a sip. The air inside the house grew thick with heat and fear. Matthew stayed close. He carried buckets from the well, chopped wood for the stove, and stood outside their bedroom doors for long stretches, running one hand along the back of his neck, as though trying to hold himself together by sheer force of will. Late on the second night, when Ruth's fever climbed high enough to send her into fevered murmurs, crying out for a mother she barely remembered, Clara dropped to her knees beside the bed. Her hands trembled over the child's damp hair, and without thinking, without ceremony, she began to pray aloud. "Father in heaven, please." Her voice cracked, but she pushed forward, holding Ruth's hand tight between both of hers. "I've seen loss, more than my share, and I don't know if I could carry another." Tears slid down her face unchecked. "These girls, they've been through enough. Let them stay. Let them heal. I'll do right by them if you let them stay." Behind her, the floorboards creaked. Clara turned, expecting to find Matthew standing there in the shadows, but instead, she saw all 5 of the other girls, silent, pale, and wide-eyed, kneeling one by one beside her. Hannah started first, folding her hands the way she remembered from church days long gone. Then Eliza, still coughing but determined. Then Sarah, then Rachel, and finally, Addie, crawling forward, clutching her blanket, whispering her own small, broken prayer. Matthew watched from the doorway, his arms crossed tight over his chest, as though holding back something that threatened to break loose. That night, the fever broke. By morning, Ruth's breathing eased. Color returned to her cheeks. The sharp heat in her skin cooled to something bearable. The others followed in slow succession, still weak but no longer drifting toward danger. Clara sat by the hearth later that day, her head bowed, exhaustion pulling at every muscle in her body. Matthew entered quietly, settling into the chair across from her. For a long time, neither spoke. Then Matthew cleared his throat, staring down at the floor like he wasn't sure where to start. "I heard you last night," he said finally. "Praying." Clara closed her eyes. "I didn't know what else to do." He nodded slowly. "I'm glad you did." The room went quiet again, but this time the silence felt softer. That evening, when Clara prepared supper, just a simple pot of beans and cornbread, the girls gathered around the table without being called. Before anyone picked up a spoon, Hannah spoke. "Can we say grace?" Clara's throat tightened, but she nodded. And there, with hands linked around the table, the family, fractured and healing, bowed their heads together. Afterward, as the girls carried their plates to the sink and laughter returned, quiet but genuine, Clara caught Matthew watching her from across the room. For the first time, there was no guarded distance in his eyes, no hesitation, only something steady and warm. And for the first time since she arrived, Clara let herself believe. Maybe this was how belonging began. Winter deepened its hold on the land. Mornings arrived slow and pale, the sun rising late over frost-crusted fields. The air tasted of wood smoke and cold iron, and each breath left small clouds hanging like unanswered questions in the dawn. Clara pulled her shawl tighter around her shoulders as she stepped onto the porch, a basket of mending tucked beneath her arm. The sky stretched wide and colorless above her, but for the first time, the emptiness didn't press down on her. Inside the house, the girls sang while they worked, off-key, mismatched tunes as they swept the floors or shelled dried beans for supper. It was Addie who first started calling her Mama. It happened without fanfare, without warning, on a gray afternoon when Clara bent to wipe the child's mouth after lunch. "Thank you, Mama," Addie murmured, her small voice sticky with molasses and shyness. The room went still. Rachel froze mid-step with a basket of laundry. Eliza gasped audibly. Hannah looked up from her reading, eyes wide and watchful. Matthew, seated at the far end of the table sharpening a knife, stopped mid-stroke. The blade remained still in his hand, but his gaze slowly lifted to meet Clara's. For one long, suspended second, no one moved. Then Clara, heart pounding too hard to speak, gave a soft smile and brushed a stray curl from Addie's face. "You're welcome, sweetheart," she said gently, voice trembling at the edges. That night, after the lamps were blown low and the girls had drifted to sleep beneath their patchwork quilts, Clara sat alone by the fire, staring into the slow burn of the coals. Her Bible rested open in her lap, but she hadn't read a word. Her hands sat idle, her mind too full. The word lingered. Mama. It pressed against her ribs like something too big for the space inside her chest. Matthew appeared in the doorway, hat in hand, like a man unsure if he should speak or walk away. When she looked up, he cleared his throat. "I heard it." he said, voice rough but low. Clara nodded, unsure what else to do. I didn't tell her to say it, she whispered, blinking fast against the sting behind her eyes. I know. For a moment he stayed where he was, shifting his weight from one boot to the other, shoulders tense. Then, without looking directly at her, he added, Didn't mind hearing it, though. Clara's breath caught. He turned before she could answer, disappearing back down the hall, leaving her with the fire, the silence, and the slow, unfamiliar warmth blooming in her chest. Over the next few weeks, the girls followed Addie's lead. First Rachel, then Sarah, then one by one the others. Not always in moments of need, sometimes just in passing. A quick, Mama, look at this, or Mama, can I help? Spoken without hesitation. Each time, Clara felt something in her steadying and breaking all at once. One afternoon, while sewing near the window, she found herself whispering another prayer. Lord, if this is your doing, help me be enough for them. The words settled in the quiet room like dust on sunbeams. When Sunday arrived, Clara asked if she could take the girls into town for church. Matthew hesitated, scratching the back of his neck, gaze low. We haven't been in a long while, he admitted. All the more reason to go, she said, her tone gentle but firm. And so they did. The girls wore dresses Clara had mended, their hair neatly braided. They rode in the wagon, laughter bouncing along with every jostle of the wheels, their voices full of anticipation. Matthew drove them, silent but present, his hands steady on the reins. At the small wooden church, the girls sat in a row, fidgeting through the hymns, sneaking smiles at Clara when she caught their eyes. When the preacher spoke of second chances and the healing of broken families, Clara bowed her head and closed her eyes, letting the words settle somewhere deep. As they left the church, Addie slipped her hand into Clara's without asking, and for the first time, walking back toward the wagon with sunlight warming her shoulders, Clara felt what it meant to be needed, truly needed. By the time they reached the ranch house, she knew this wasn't just a stop along the way anymore. This was home. By late January, the ranch settled into a rhythm Clara had never expected, but couldn't deny. Days filled with the scrape of chairs, the clatter of dishes, the sound of small feet running across wood floors. The girls followed her through every task, helping in the kitchen, learning to patch holes in dresses, gathering firewood from the edge of the pasture. They braided her hair while she read aloud by lamplight. They stood beside her at the pump, fighting over who got to carry the next bucket. Laughter returned to the house, not all at once, but in slow, uneven bursts like sunlight breaking through winter clouds. And Matthew, he changed too. He lingered longer after meals, shoulders less tense, eyes softer. He asked Clara's opinion about fence repairs, about crop rotation, about what she thought the girls needed most now that winter was halfway through. One cold evening, as Clara sat mending socks by the hearth, Matthew entered with 2 mugs of coffee. He offered her one without words. Their fingers brushed as she took it. The touch stayed with her longer than it should have. Later that night, long after the house had gone quiet, Clara sat at her window, staring at the frozen fields silvered by moonlight. Her Bible rested open on her lap, but she wasn't reading. She whispered again into the dark, the same prayer she'd spoken so many times before, but this time with different weight. Lord, I don't know what this is between us. I don't know if it's meant for more than friendship, or if that's all it should ever be, but whatever it is, let me be grateful for it. Let me be wise with it. Her voice trembled. And let me guard my heart if that's what's best for them, and for me. 2 days later, as Clara hung sheets on the line, Matthew walked across the yard toward her, wiping sweat from his brow despite the cold air. There's a property matter I need to tell you about, he said, stopping a few paces away. Clara straightened. What is it? Neighbor down by the south pasture, Reuben Cutter, claims part of the boundary's his, says the markers are off. Her stomach sank. Is there truth to it? Matthew shook his head. None, but he's making noise in town, talking to folks, stirring up trouble. A long pause settled between them. I'll go into town tomorrow, he said, shifting his weight. Speak to the magistrate. Show the deed. Clara nodded, fingers clenching in the damp fabric she held. Just be careful, she said quietly. That night after the girls had gone to bed, Clara stayed awake near the fire, her sewing untouched in her lap. Matthew paced near the front window, staring out into the dark. Finally, unable to bear the distance between them, she rose and crossed the room. "You'll handle it," she said, resting a hand lightly on his arm. "You always do." For the first time, Matthew's gaze dropped to her hand, and stayed there. "I'm tired of fighting for this land," he admitted, voice low and rough. "But I'm more tired of losing things I care about." Her breath caught. "Then don't lose this," she whispered, the words slipping out before she could call them back. His eyes met hers, steady, searching. But before either of them could say more, Addie called from upstairs, crying out from a bad dream. The moment broke like thin ice beneath heavy boots. Clara pulled away first, moving toward the stairs. But as she climbed, her heart beat fast and hard, each step carrying her further from the conversation she wasn't sure she was ready to finish. Upstairs, as she soothed Addie back to sleep, Clara whispered another prayer, her hand smoothing the child's hair. "Lord, whatever this is, help me walk through it with grace. Help." Downstairs, Matthew stood alone by the hearth, staring at the dying fire, knowing in his bones that something between them had shifted and would never settle back the way it was before. Matthew's trip to town stretched longer than expected. By the time he returned 2 days later, his shoulders carried more weight than when he left. The wagon wheels crunched over frost-hardened ground as he pulled into the yard near sundown, the horses moving slow, their breath rising in soft clouds. Clara stood on the porch, wiping her hands on her apron, her heart climbing to her throat at the sight of him. The girls burst through the front door, cheering his arrival, but Clara hung back, waiting. Matthew climbed down from the wagon, tipping his hat toward her with a tired nod. "Magistrate sided with the deed," he said. "Land stays ours." Relief swept through her so quickly she had to grab hold of the porch railing to steady herself. But she saw it in his face. The fight had cost him something. That night after supper, while the girls gathered near the fire with sewing projects and storybooks, Matthew lingered outside longer than usual. Clara found him standing near the fence line, staring toward the south pasture, as though expecting trouble to ride in from the horizon. She approached slowly, pulling her shawl tighter against the cold. "You did what needed doing," she said softly, stopping just behind him. He didn't turn, but his voice reached her like gravel shifting underfoot. "Feels like all I've done these past few years is fight to keep things from falling apart." Clara swallowed hard, stepping closer until they stood shoulder to shoulder beneath the wide, star-pinned sky. "You're not holding it together alone anymore," she said, her voice low, steady. "You've got help now." For the first time, Matthew turned fully to face her. The moonlight caught the tired lines around his eyes, but there was something else there, too. Something warmer, less guarded. "I know I do," he said, voice quieter now, "and I'm grateful for it." Before she could speak, he lifted one rough hand and let it settle lightly at her elbow, just enough to make her breath catch. For a long, suspended moment, they stayed like that, half a step from something neither dared name. The next morning, before dawn had fully broken, Matthew knocked once on the frame of the kitchen door while she prepared bread for baking. "I've got business in town next week," he said, voice casual but too carefully so. "I thought maybe you'd come along. Pick out whatever you need for the house, maybe something for yourself too." Clara paused, hands deep in flour. "I'd like that," she said, keeping her tone even though her heart jumped inside her chest. The trip came on a cold, bright morning. Clara sat beside him on the wagon bench, the girls bundled in the back, laughter spilling out behind them as they jostled for room. In town, Matthew bought her fabric, blue calico again, like the first bolt he'd left folded on her bed weeks ago. At the dry goods counter, while the girls picked candy sticks and small paper dolls, Matthew added a small gold pin to the pile of purchases. When Clara reached for her coin purse, he stopped her with a look. "This one's from me," he said simply. Her hands trembled as she accepted it. On the way home, the air filled with the sound of the girls singing a hymn they half remembered from church. "Shall we gather at the river?" they sang, voices thin but sweet against the wind. Clara joined in without thinking, her voice folding into theirs like a missing note finally found. That night, after the girls were asleep and the house lay quiet, Clara stood on the porch alone, staring out across the dark pasture. Her Bible rested in her hands, fingers pressed between two pages as though holding her place between one chapter and the next. When Matthew's footsteps approached behind her, she didn't turn. "Clara," he said, voice low and certain, "there's something I want to ask you." Her breath caught, her fingers tightening on the worn leather cover. "All right," she whispered, eyes still on the horizon. But before he could speak the words, she closed her Bible gently and turned to face him, ready for whatever came next. Matthew's hands shook, not enough for most to notice, but Clara did. He stood there on the porch, hat in one hand, the other curled loose at his side like he wasn't sure where to put it. "I won't say it fancy," he started, voice rough with nerves. "And I don't have much to offer beyond what you already see." Clara's breath held still inside her chest. "But this house—" He looked toward the windows where the girls slept, their silhouettes faint against the curtains. "This land, these girls, me, we're yours if you want us." Her heart broke open and reformed in the same beat. Matthew stepped closer, close enough she could see the pulse in his throat, the fine tremor in his shoulders. "I'm not asking because I need help," he continued. "And I'm not asking out of obligation or loneliness. I'm asking because somewhere between your bread and your prayers and the way you hold those girls when they cry, I started wanting this life with you in it." Clara swallowed against the lump rising in her throat. "I can't promise I won't fail at it now and then," he said, softer now. "But I'll show up every day and try." Her reply came quiet but certain, steady as dawn breaking over cold ground. "Yes," just one word. But it landed with the weight of every silent longing she'd buried since the day she stepped off that wagon. Matthew's shoulders dropped, some unseen burden lifting, and without hesitation, he pulled her into his arms. The embrace wasn't rushed, wasn't desperate, just sure. The next Sunday, they stood before the small congregation at the town's wooden church. The girls dressed in their best, lined up like wildflowers along the aisle. There was no white gown, no satin gloves. Just Clara in her blue calico dress, her hair pinned up with trembling fingers, and Matthew standing beside her with both hands steady for the first time in months. The preacher kept the ceremony short and plain. When he asked Matthew if he took Clara to be his wife, Matthew answered with the same certainty he brought to fixing fences and calming frightened daughters. "I do." When it was Clara's turn, her voice rang out clearer than she expected. "I do," she said, sealing it with a smile she hadn't worn in years. Afterward, back at the ranch, the girls gathered wildflowers from the pasture and placed them in glass jars along the table. Hannah baked her first loaf of bread under Clara's watchful eye. The younger girls drew pictures on scraps of paper, stick figures with smiling faces and big, lopsided hearts. Before supper, Clara stood at the head of the table looking at each of them. 6 girls, each with their own small scars and stories, and then at Matthew, whose quiet strength had become something she leaned on more than she ever meant to. She bowed her head and the girls followed. Her prayer came without hesitation this time. "Lord, we thank you for full tables, warm fires, and second chances, for hands to hold and hearts to heal, for laughter returned and new beginnings. Let this house stay full, not just with food, but with love. Amen." When she lifted her head, she found Matthew watching her with something deep and reverent in his gaze. That night, as the fire burned low and the snow drifted soft against the windows, Clara sat near the hearth with Addie asleep in her lap and the others sprawled nearby. Matthew crossed the room, placed a kiss on her temple, and whispered just loud enough for her to hear, "You've mended more here than you'll ever know." And in that quiet, flickering light, with the girls safe and the world outside hushed under winter's soft hand, Clara believed it. Finally, fully, believed it.